through New York law and human rights circles. She is a distinguished professor, the Ernst C. Stiefel Professor of Comparative Law at New York Law School in the city. She's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science in London. Her first book, which is called Transitional Justice, came out from Oxford University Press in 2000 and was one of, I think, the first and most important books in what became the transitional justice literature of the time. The idea of how you do justice after a period of oppression or atrocities. And it really helped define the field when it came out. She has a new book out, which I think is already doing the same thing. Her new book is called Humanity's Law, a beautiful book, again done by Oxford University Press. It was recently called by Geoffrey Robertson, who's one of the leading human rights lawyers and scholars over in England, one of the 2 or 3 best books in human rights of the year in 2011. It's part of a series of new books that are coming out that are basically, after years of people being depressed about human rights and how human rights is a great ideal but doesn't work, are starting to celebrate the successes of a number of human rights legal victories around the world. And making a claim that there is a new and actionable and meaningful idea of international law, which is now being, in a sense, collapsing, and she'll talk about a number of different strains of international law into a new idea called humanities law, or international human rights law. I have a series of discounted flyers that her press has generously provided. You save $7 if you order from one of these flyers, the book. So I will...
You can save even more on Amazon. So.
And you can even save more on Amazon, so you can take your pick. However you want to order it, it's a book that I think is very much well worth reading for human rights majors here at Bard. And I'm sure you'll start seeing it in some of your classes in the next couple of years. In any case, it's my pleasure to welcome Ruti Teitel.
Thanks a lot, Roger, and see other friends, Tom, and very good to be here. So I think maybe 2 times, once before at Clark, but for a conference. It's wonderful to be back. So Roger mentioned transitional justice. What I started seeing after I wrote Transitional Justice in 2000 was a book where I really focused on political and legal responses after repression and political conflict. And what became apparent was that even though there were a number of places in the world which seemed to be sort of lurching towards democratic peace, that the issues concerning the relationship of law and violence weren't solved in many cases in the transition. And this has led to a lot of writing, for example, about the role of transitional justice not after the conflict, but before and during conflict. And so, since I cared to confine the term of transitional justice to the period of transition, I started focusing really on what was the nature of law that was really, that pertained now to these periods of what I'm going to describe as rather changed conflict. It's not the traditional understanding of war that focused on relations between states and had this view of an honor code guiding war. Instead, the key idea in humanities law is that there's a transformation in the key goal, and that rather than the focus on state security, that a lot of the conflicts we're seeing emphasize the protection of and security of persons and peoples. And what I talk about in the book and tease out over 300 pages is really what the framework is of humanities law. I argue that there is this new law, which is really three bodies of existing law: the law of war, the law of human rights, and international criminal justice. I say, and I'm going to say a little something about each of these frameworks. While that framework appears to be emerging now, it definitely has resonances and connects to early pre-modern thinkers such as Hugo Grotius, who was really the architect of international law. And in my book, I go into that history and his understanding of the way law, and in particular international law, was really a key defining modality in constructing global society. So that's, in a nutshell, what I want to talk about, but I think really the best way to develop this idea of humanities law is to talk about some key moments historically in the last 15 years where we can see this concept developing, and then along the way talk about some illustrations of where it's been invoked by political leaders and others. And I want to make clear that the purchase of this idea, if it has any, is really, does it help us understand the current moment better? And it's a discourse that I argue in the book is used not just by state actors, but by non-state actors, NGOs, by private actors, individuals, by multilateral institutions such as the UN, and in particular we're seeing a lot of play in the Security Council. So the book maps this rise of humanities law, and in particular I just want to talk about these three strands and how we can see these strands developing. You can go back 50, 60 years to the end of World War II for some of these developments, but I want to also show how it's different today, and elements where there's, where we can see a kind of consolidation. So the strand that I talked about, this transformation of the way we thought of international law in the 20th century. And, I teach international law, and I also teach international human rights law and transitional justice. So when you think about international law, most of the books in this area really describe the themes, the goals of international law, the subjects of international law in terms of the state. It's state-centric, sovereignty-based. What international law does is reflect state interests, and conflict is also defined in those terms. Now, what we start seeing in recent years is a change in that view, and part of what I describe as informing the humanity law framework is restoring other subjects, persons and peoples, who had been very present in the pre-modern state understanding. They helped shape the practices we know of as the jus gentium, the law of peoples, that later became known as law of nations. But it wasn't really confined to state centricity. There were a number of areas of law, the law of aliens, trade law, which specifically recognized the input of other actors. Now, so that's really, it's this move from that understanding. Some people describe this, have said that I'm describing a paradigm shift, and the blurbs on the back suggest that. I'm always uncomfortable with, saying that I'm inventing a paradigm shift or describing a paradigm shift. Maybe it is, we'll see. Let's think about some areas where the categories as they were understood are breaking down. So one place, and I'll describe about three. People seem to like trinities. I'm sure that's the general culture that we're in, right? The breakdown of the categories of war and peace. So there are bodies of law, and international law tends to govern two major areas where states came together. And it's pretty obvious. The market, trade, and war, right? That's how states come together. The peaceful links are trade, and the others less peaceful. And so, the area of war is now in the midst of change, and what we see is that, by some we're in a more peaceful time, certainly since the end of the Cold War. But what we saw post-Cold War is that we didn't have an immediate peace dividend, but rather the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and this conflict that was, in some parts of the region internal and in others international. So, this kind of undermining of the usual stability of international law, because the law of war tends to separate these two out, and there's a whole body of law that regulates international conflict in the Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions, and another body of law that governs internal conflict. Now, what we see in recent cases is a greater willingness to entertain that some conflicts are both internal and international, and to move away from that very strict view of conflict. I think it's a realistic view, because in many of these instances, whether the Ituri conflict in Congo or the conflict in the Balkans, some of the conflict is internal and some of it is international. But that very understanding really only corresponded to the view from the perspective of a state, right? And where the major focus is protection of state borders. If the lens is from the human perspective and protection of the human, then what difference should it make whether a conflict is internal or international, and with regard to the guarantee or degree of protection? And so this is part of what is being figured out in a number of different conflicts. There are a number of very interesting tribunals and courts that have gone into this, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But so that's one of the changes is really this question of change in the legal regime that applies to war and peace. And I'll bring in the strand of human rights law in just a second, because not only do we have changes in the strands that relate to war, but the law of peace, of course, is human rights law. That's what applies internationally during peacetime. And here, too, we see changes. The area of human rights was always viewed as a set of claims that one could make vis-a-vis the state, and in general, state action had to be shown. It was like constitutional law. It was seen as a claim that citizens had vis-a-vis states. Now, this too is changing, and with a number of different scenarios, the quote-unquote global war on terror, other areas involving human security, the claims are no longer being made in those terms. And we see more and more recognition by courts of expanded duties that states have, even when the action might be private action. So, for example, militias or gangsters in a drug war. And this too involves a part of this area, this framework that I call humanities law, because the overriding aim in these in caring less about those what had been acoustically separated ideas or categories, the overriding goal in these decisions by judges is the protection of the human. Now, in terms of the law of war, there's one other strand that I want to add here that had been separated since the pre-Westphalia, and that is the just war, the aspect of the law of war that also brings in not just how a war is waged, but when is initiation of war normatively right. And this goes to the heart of what I'm describing here, which is that, if I were to distill this book to a one-liner, which I hate doing, but I will do just to try it out, it is that there is more and more legalization and meshing of the law in areas of conflict with the goal of human security. And what we see is that this value is not just a constraint on action, but is also something that can operate as a basis for intervention. Intervention of many kinds: military intervention, legal intervention, etc. And this will, I hope we'll have time in Q&A to get into some of the tensions. I know that Roger has branded me an optimist, but I'm a realistic optimist, and certainly this set of developments is not necessarily always going to result in a progressive result. There are areas of tension, and certainly the normativity way exceeds the execution and the current institutionalization of these ideas. So there is still a gap, let's say, between substance and process. That's could be one way to understand it. Now, just to go back to the change in terms of the use ad bellum, the old idea that was sometimes described as the just war tradition, we see a greater willingness since the end of the Cold War to intervene militarily with the asserted aim of human security. The most recent example, which was explicitly justified on these grounds, was Libya. It was the first time that the responsibility to protect was enunciated in a Security Council resolution that was about clearing the airspace, if you will. We later saw that it was regime change that would result. But certainly it was clear that it would be military intervention, and this is bringing together the idea of justice and the use of force in a very clear way. It's not provided for in the Security Council, the other materials that the Security Council relies on, such as the UN Charter. The UN Charter sets out state security and protection of state borders, and that really was the legal framework that the Security Council has been operating in since the end of World War II. So this is, and there's certainly precedents that I want to get into that predate Libya, such as the intervention in the Balkans in Kosovo. But so what we start seeing is a greater tolerance for this kind of justification. And part of the argument here is that if we can better understand the asserted justifications and the aims of this humanity law discourse, the way it's being used both politically and legally by both political actors and legal actors, then we can, I think, develop a better evaluative and critical eye. To what extent are the justifications genuine? Are they really deliverable? Is there a practical plan? Those are the kinds of evaluative schemes we could raise. Now, the last, I mentioned the internal and international, which relates to this change in conflict. The last aspect of the way law is changing in this framework is the move to add the coercive enforcement. Certainly since, again, the Treaty of Westphalia, the relationship of states and the protection of state sovereignty certainly had consequences for the extent to which there was consensus in any kind of international society on a willingness to entertain mechanisms of judgment, shall we say. If you think of the writings, if you go back to the writings of Hugo Grotius, part of the concern once you get into the modern state and the consolidation of state borders is there really is no shared concept of who would be the appropriate judge, of where judgment would lie. And so it's always seen as politicized, this idea of judgment. Now, today, one could say au contraire, and that there's this alacrity with which there is a turn to tribunalization and to, a quest for an independent judicial eye. And that's gone hand in hand with a move away from collective enforcement. So this is the third dimension of change. war and peace, international and internal, and the last bit is the move away from collective understandings of punishment and enforcement, which are really at the heart of the existing post-World War II security framework. When the Security Council issues sanctions, in the past the sanctions were seen as something that was collective, it was on a country, right? And these, you know, if you think back to the really controversial sanctions in Iraq, and the impact that had on the humanitarian aims, the impact that it had on the people of Iraq. I'm not talking about the most recent intervention in Iraq, but going back at the time of the attempt to occupy Kuwait by Saddam Hussein and George Bush Sr. That was a highly controversial moment. The use of collective sanctions, even with a just cause, right? The likely genocide of Kurds on the border. It was a very tough time, and I think it pits, these aims. It really is an interesting lens to think about these ends. Well, part of what we're seeing is that if humanity's law logic is going to be the comprehensive value, the value is human security, then the sanctions can't imperil the humanitarian well-being. And so what we start seeing is that the aims are framed in terms of protection of persons and peoples, but that, in the past the normativity had developed, but the enforcement lagged way behind. Now the way out of this is to focus on the individual. And what we see is even at the Security Council, the sanctions are becoming targeted sanctions, right? And the most recent set of sanctions that the Arab League came up with respect to Syria also sought to carefully delineate a line. And look, it's not going to be a perfect line because already there are questions being raised about how the sanctions that have been that they've approved. It's the first time really that the Arab League has approved sanctions on their own vis-a-vis a state in the region, and there will be economic consequences that no doubt transcend just the existing regime and their supporters. Nevertheless, it's that effort to single them out, and that is really part of the targeting process. And we've seen this shift in both areas of civil law. We can see it in lawsuits in the United States on human rights grounds. We can see it in regional tribunals in Europe and in Latin America. And we also see it in this rush to create new criminal courts and to pull together the sort of this moralizing aim and value of human protection together with the harshest form of law, criminal law, and really to condemn those who are outliers and violating these norms. And so it's really a remarkable list of criminal courts in the last 10, 15 years. And so I just want to take you through that, I'll try to be brief, take you through that history because it really gives us a sense of some of these three changes, the way the framework has evolved, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to see how this has panned out in the move towards a responsibility to protect and in both Libya and potentially other places as well in the near future. Now, I just want to say, my work is interpretive. It's not a 300-page op-ed. It's not necessarily exhorting for these developments. It's kind of, my prior book also was interpretive. I'm happy to talk about what that means. But basically, it's really looking at these changes and trying to make sense of them. So if we go to Nuremberg, which is an interesting moment. I want to talk about Nuremberg, and then I'll talk about the ICTY and ICTR, these exceptional tribunals, ad hoc tribunals that were created at the end of the Cold War, and then talk about the ICC, and then we can pull to the present and see how the Security Council is operating together with the criminal court and using the criminal court for its purposes. Now, the Nuremberg moment is very interesting. Nuremberg is today generally remembered for its human rights legacy. It's often, when you read a book like Lou Hankins or traditional human rights books, they often say that the birth of the human rights movement was at Nuremberg. But what I want to emphasize is that there were really these three strands that I'm talking about came together then. It was a brief moment, but it was a moment that related to a particular conflict. And you have really what was seen as the major offense at Nuremberg at the time. Now we think of the crimes against humanity as the major concern, but really at the time it was the war, it was aggression, and this is really the strand that relates to the just war, right? It was punishing and I want to talk about the individuation. It was very significant that you have individuation of punishment, right? That's, a central theme at Nuremberg. The reason that's important is that seen historically, Germany had been punished as a country after World War I. And that was, it was Versailles and the very heavy collective sanctions, monetary sanctions. And, so we can compare, the effect of collective sanctions versus individual criminal punishment. And so that move already occurred at Nuremberg. Now, is the tribunal as international as what we have today? No. It can be seen as victor's justice in the sense that they were victors, right? And they don't prosecute their own shortcomings and their own war crimes. And certainly. The attempt today to have a standing court, which I'll talk about in just a bit, the International Criminal Court is in a sense in bits foreshadowed by Nuremberg, but is also different. It couldn't be more international. It was the product of a General Assembly debate and resolutions. It now has hundreds of countries that are signatories and many regions of the world represented. And the major difference is that it's a standing court and can't be accused of victor's justice because it weighs in before you even know what the result of the war will be. So that's a difference. But Nuremberg was individuated. It brought together these strands of both the just war tradition, the punishing what was seen as unjust aggression. And it brought together war crimes, the execution of the war, right, violations that involved that related to the waging of war, and it brought together this new piece, crimes against humanity. But I'm saying we remember it now for that innovation of having crimes against humanity codified in a sense because it was in the charter, in the statute at the time of Nuremberg. It was really the first time that it was defined and written down in that way. There were, of course, invocations to crimes against humanity previously in remonstrances, mostly regarding religious persecution, but also crimes during World War I. Now, this crossroads is a very interesting crossroads, and you have this emphasis on enforcement, and you also have this recognition that it shouldn't matter whether, with respect to crimes against humanity, it shouldn't matter whether these are civilians that were civilians in Germany or civilians in foreign countries. And that was also a very significant moment that we later see is being underscored today. And, the critical language in the Nuremberg Charter, and I still think this is the most important word in the entire Charter, and it's a very short word, it's a preposition, any civilian population. So just having, it was this idea that this is universalizable, even if it's with respect to a conflict and certain states involved, that it really isn't just about protecting in the old way that the law of war protected. Now, I want to move on to talk about the more current moment, but I think what's important is that at the end of Nuremberg, at the end of World War II, as we all know, the Cold War set in, and there were political realities that made, shoring up that judgment and codifying it and creating a standing court impossible, right? And there are those who think that the current moment, in a way, is sort of a revival of that idea of the possibility of having a international community of judgment. But what we do see is that the normativity moves on. that you do have a genocide convention that is passed during the Cold War, and you have a number of other conventions that relate to expansion of humanitarian norms in wars of self-determination. You have, a number of developments in the 70s and 80s. You have expansion of the Geneva Conventions. But what's very interesting about all of those is that they do not have the international consensus to create added enforcement bodies. It is understood at the time that enforcement will depend on states and ideas of reciprocity. And you do have references with respect to genocide that third-party states should enforce. And there are, there is a duty, you could say, in the Geneva Convention that with respect to the worst crimes in international conflict, grave breaches, that other states have a duty to enforce. But you certainly don't have the institutionalization that we're seeing today. So it's an interesting moment, the post-Cold War moment. I mean, the Cold War moment, because it kind of gives us this flavor of a certain commitment to, you could say, norms in the air to some extent, but really the way that the sovereignty question is resolved or reconciled with these arguably universalizable norms is that states are the first actors that have to enforce, and in many cases it will be the first and probably the last. Now, what happens in the post-Cold War moment is that you see what I'm arguing, which is this realignment of the relationship of law to the use of force, a very bewildering set of developments. And that is that at the end of the Cold War, and surprise, surprise, a recognition of a variety of states that had unresolved transitional justice going back to World War II, relations between Serb, Croat, and Muslim peoples in the region. In retrospect, it all should have been very clear, but it wasn't. And then really the issue became, the turn, what is, as I said, bewildering and very interesting is this turn to law and invocations of justice during conflict. Now, to what extent is this just rhetoric? Well, part of what one sees is the significance of the move to individual punishment. Certainly at the beginning, there was an absence of consensus on more coercive relationship of law to the use of force, which would be to authorize intervention. And even when intervention occurs, it's not explicitly authorized by the Security Council. So we see that politics runs out, right? Politics runs out, and coercion comes in, which is the use of both the law and military means. And that would not have been surprising that relationship would not have been surprising to Grotius, but he, I think many theorists, political analysts, and legal theorists at the time of the Balkans would argue that this should at least be limited to very clear cases of genocide and crimes against humanity. What was very interesting, and I think is really the most contested issue about the Balkans, was the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, much of the conflict was internal and yet was being considered as a threat to international peace and security. And what the Security Council declares after there's evidence that was gathered by a journalist, Roy Gutman, he was writing for a Long Island paper, had interviews and video of incarceration and detention camps, and he called them concentration camps. It wasn't annihilation that was going on, but there was definitely torture, and then later there were parts, we certainly saw that there were parts of the region where there was genocidal killings. So that revelation started the drumbeat for demand to do something, and in particular that video was very significant because It showed, these emaciated detainees behind barbed wire, and it looked, it was like in the heart of Europe. Is this going to happen again? And now it will be on the UN watch, Security Council watch. And as I said, the politics did not, given how split many of the states in the Security Council were. The French, going back to World War II, were still very pro-Serb and protected many of the fugitives on the run till the very recent days. The Germans were the first to recognize Croatia. I mean, in many ways, you could see that the politics couldn't be solved. And so what you find is the Security Council authorizing a court under its UN Charter, Chapter 7 powers, which are all about restoring the peace. And it's this very interesting relationship that I'm asking you to entertain, which is the relationship of peace and justice, of bringing law in and justice to address conflict. And here it's stated in a very, the expectations are very high. The UN Charter, Chapter 7 basis for this court, the ICTY, was essentially that the court could deter future the ongoing violations, and that it could restore peace in the region. And then I would say the most ambitious goals are reconciliation. The idea that it's not just deterrence, right? And those of you who may are interested in law, generally we think of criminal law and courts as achieving the goal of deterrence, and that is something that relates to peace and stability. And so that's not a surprising goal for the criminal criminal justice. But it was also this added view that somehow there could be reconciliation between peoples. And how would that occur? So that's really a very interesting moment. And since I'm interested not just in human rights that relate to persons and individuals, but really also the relationship of individuals to peoples, and that was really at the heart of this conflict. What you find is that the court was explicitly ethno-conscious. Everyone was identified by their ethnicity, from the prosecutors to the defense counsel to defendants. And in particular, the central crime was the crime of ethnic cleansing, the offense of ethnic cleansing. And no one had seen that term written down, expressed that way. I still use it in quotes. It can't be mistaken for a normative term, for a term, that view that there is ethnic cleansing, right? That we're involved somehow in any kind of vindication of ethnic cleansing. It came from the fact that elites had supported the Milosevic strategy, including a white paper that was part of the Academy of Science in Serbia, and they referred to it, and Milosevic referred to pollution by various peoples in the region, and talked about the need to ethnically cleanse Serbia. And that was really, it remains, I would argue, the most contested norm that all of these tribunals and legalization are addressing. Genocide has been accepted since the end of World War II. War crimes have a pedigree that is much older, right? It goes back, really, you could go back to the Bible and earlier other religious codes that talk about don't burn the land, don't attack women and children, targets that are seen as not related to military targets, not necessary, not proportional. But the question of limiting the sovereign from ethnic cleansing is not about annihilation. It's about changing, right? Cleansing. What is being ethnically cleansed? The land. Okay. And what is being limited here, and was really at the heart of the tribunal, and really the normative change. If you will, the court was doing norm entrepreneurial business, because what they were trying to do is punish this purposeful policy to purge from various parts of Serbia the civilian population that belonged to different ethnic groups. And so it's really a set of different, it's punishing a variety of means. Sometimes it can be another crime against humanity. Sometimes it could be rape or murder, but not always. It could be busing people from one part of the land to another if it's done systematically and involves the elements I've talked about, widespread and systematic. So this was really the Security Council saying that when the leaders in the Serbian regime do this, this goes to the heart and somehow undermines international security. And it's that connection really that reminds us of the relationship of individuals to peoples and peoples to humanity. And it really continues, I would argue, to be a contested norm. It's one of the most difficult offenses to prove and to apply. Certainly the ICC has been involved in related prosecutions in largely coming out of the conflict in parts of Africa, but it was really at the heart of what the ICTY tribunal was out to do. Now what's very interesting is that the ICTR also had norm change in how they define genocide. Part of the way they dealt with some of these issues involving what was clearly internal conflict. So that was yet another step in what I'm talking about, because the genocide in Rwanda was clearly internal. Of course, that depends whether you regard as sacrosanct the existing borders of Rwanda, when in fact many of the issues and conflict between Hutu and Tutsi related to the entire region, in particular Burundi, and that's part of what we're seeing is that these conflicts can't be solved unless they're seen from a humanity law lens. And with respect to the EICTR, they took a broader view of how peoples would be defined for purposes of genocide. And all of this is to say that that part of what we saw during the post-Cold War period was really a move away from seeing the business of international law and international tribunals as the protection of state security as understood as protecting existing state borders, which had a very long legacy in international law, and it goes by this fancy Latin term which one is obliged to teach in international law, ute possidetis, which says that the default norm is you protect existing borders, and it really shifts the concern for the protection of human security, and in many cases judges played with the very issue of what category of law would apply. Certainly that was the case in the ICTY. Ted Moreno is both a jurist and was president of the tribunal and was very active in developing the law in this direction. Now, let me just, what do I have, another 10 minutes or so? 10, 15? Yeah.
About 10 minutes.
Okay, so you know how it is with professors. In the beginning they think they're going to talk short, and then it's always very long. So, but maybe it's not very long so far. But let me add the ICC, okay? And that is the what you have coming out of these tribunals. First of all, what's very interesting is they haven't ended. Everyone thought this would be a shorter deal, but they always give them an additional budget. People say it's kind of they can't thrive, but they survive, right? And so the ad hoc tribunals continue. There's a very interesting scholarship about the relationship of these judgments to local justice, and that's goes back to my work on transitional justice. I'm happy to get into that in questions if anybody is interested. But part of what we see is that they go on to play different roles, and again, often this the view that the courts and this body of exists in order to apply judgment and to condemn this treatment of peoples, ethnic peoples. This continues to play a very active role, for example, in Europe. The EU has indicated, and very recently, that Serbia's membership in the EU and also in the accession process for Turkey, that they have to make clear steps to show that they will respect these norms and will, actually bring, with respect to Serbia, bring the last big fugitive to the tribunal, and that was done very recently. The General Mladic, who was the military general who was responsible militarily for the genocide at Srebrenica. Of course, that has to be found by a court of law, so you can't just quote me on that, but so that's the allegation. He was turned over to Europe, and what's very to the ICTY, and there were statements by the EU at the time that this is very important, that showing this compliance, that for states, when states show compliance to these norms, they are then going to be taken seriously in other bodies and other political unions. So that has been an interesting development. Now, just lastly, the ICC, and certainly we can talk more about this in question time. Part of what's interesting is that you have this new body, not so new, a decade. The chief prosecutor will step down at the end of this year. He is a compatriot from my home country, Argentina. I know him way back. I know him from before he became chief. He was the deputy prosecutor in the trial of the generals in the junta in Argentina. And what he said when he first took office is, these are the first steps of a court of last resort. And that underscores for us that the way state sovereignty was going to be reconciled with this, these changing norms and enforcement machines was to say that yes, the normativity exists and there is going to be a court, but the jurisdiction of the court is quote unquote complementary, okay? Not like complementary like you look so good, but with an E, and it basically is filling the gaps, okay? Filling the gaps of where states are either unwilling or unable to do this themselves. And so the court has become a very active body because much of its action is behind the scenes. There hasn't been a conviction yet, okay? And part of, now, Luis Moreno is, if he's concerned about his legacy, one of the questions, and I go back to that early statement, he said the proof of the success of this court will be if there are no convictions. There are no trials, okay? And the reason would be that here you have a group of state signatories and that this is a commitment by states not to think of state security in terms of their state interests, but rather to adhere to these humanitarian norms and the norms that I describe as involving humanity law. And so this is part of what the court is up to. I'm happy to talk about a variety of these issues. Clearly, there are political dimensions to situations that have gotten to the court. That's very interesting, is that what we're seeing, and this is part of the framework that I've been describing, is that there is a clear usefulness for political actors of these legal norms and institutions. And you can see the Security Council in a number of instances turning to the court. It wasn't the way I think people thought the court would work in the beginning. I think they thought that it would be really, a concern about a wild prosecutor, a prosecutor that was independent of the Security Council and the UN, and in fact, many of the major military powers are not members of the ICC for exactly that reason. Russia, China, and the US are not members of not the Security Council, not members of the ICC because of their concern that it would be their soldiers, and at least that's how it was expressed, not their state political leaders, but they said it was the concern that it would be their soldiers that would be hauled before the court. What's very interesting is that we're seeing even the US that isn't a signatory, and as I mentioned, many of the countries on the Security Council are not members of this institution, and yet turning to the institution in order to do what? And that's really the question. Really, the court is being brought in, enmeshed in what you could argue is the regulation of conflict. There are many instances where the court is investigating claims. Some of these are are not seen in the papers. There have been instances in Latin America, the Middle East has been referred to the court, and most recently the Mexican drug war. Okay, so what we see is a recognition by a variety of political actors that these norms don't just apply to states, but rather, but they don't also just apply to non-state actors, that states have duties to protect human security, but also non-state actors, and that where states are unwilling or unable, in some way shielding private actors, there is this increasing acceptance, and I think, certainly, if you bring this together with the Occupy movement, with the claims for accountability in the economic area, which also relates to human security, the aims for a some kind of minimal threshold of human security, also involves economic and the area of economic justice is often referred to in scholarly literature by the same name, global justice. Okay, it's very interesting. Scholars are divided the way they use that term. Human Rights Watch uses global justice to refer to criminal punishment, and then a large body of human rights scholars in other areas use it to refer to economic well-being. And minimum guarantees of medicine and other protection. So you have this movement way beyond, as I said, the application has gone beyond what people thought. And the most recent one is the R2P, the responsibility to protect, that I mentioned. And let me just say, end by talking just a couple of minutes about this. The development at the UN, as I mentioned, there's still the existing post-World War II security framework, right? The UN Charter, the same countries that were the victors at the end of the war, are in the Security Council, plus Germany. But you also have this added tinkering, let's say, at the margins that is, sort of moving in, I would say, from the periphery more and more to the center. And responsibility to protect, which started out really being discussed by NGOs and by Kofi Annan at the end of the terrible genocidal wars of the 1990s. His concern was that this happened on his watch, and he said, if there's one thing that the UN has to do is figure this out and really come up with a duty to protect, and how, what form should it take. So it started really with study groups, and then by 2005 and 2006, you start getting a number of resolutions, including at the level of the Security Council, where there is this commitment to protection, responsibility to protect. Now, what's very interesting is, for the moment, and the words of Ban Ki-moon, the commitment is narrow but deep. Okay, that could be like Brown v. Board. You have some kind of remedy, but it's going to be deliberate, right? With all deliberate speed. So narrow but deep. Narrow in the sense that it relates to only the most serious offenses, the ones I've already enumerated, that are criminal offenses at the level of the ICC. And it's very interesting. They chose to limit it to those criminal offenses: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. They didn't include environmental degradation, floods, and so on. And this is a live debate about what the responsibility to protect should be. But what they've gone on to say is that there are layered duties that relate to this, and to use again this magic word of complementarity. I would say, again, if you were going to reduce everything to one word, it would be complementarity. The world we live in involves layered duties, and so how do you reconcile sovereignty with these normative changes? The first duty is upon the states. And it's states that have to honor the responsibility to protect, including of peoples that may not be the majority ethnically in those countries. And then if those states are unable or unwilling, the exact same language that appears in the ICC, if they're unable or unwilling, then other duties kick in, including in the region and multilaterally, potentially. And that's what we saw with respect to Libya. And it was a very strange thing, because my book was going to press, and then all of a sudden I said, whoa, additions had to be made, and it's the first time really that you have that claim, and we saw in quite, okay, it wasn't days, it wasn't weeks, but there was an end to at least one kind of violence. Whether there's others that is more, whether there's other violence in the region that is more politically motivated and that has to do with other kinds of ways of thinking about the relationship of peoples, only time will tell. Let me leave time for questions, and I'll leave it there for now. So I think Roger, you're going to...
Great. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Teitel will take questions in about half an hour. So, Alan?
Yeah, two, if I'm entitled. One is general and one is specific. General.
You look familiar, so your last name?
Alan Sustin.
Yeah, I think I know.
I think normativity.
Okay.
I'm wondering if there are two normativities, or perhaps a normativity of an exclusive sort, and then all the rest. I couldn't agree more with all that you said about everything, but that...
Stop right there. Next.
But that the normativity of the legal world is one thing, and the normativity of the political world seems to be quite another. So that we have, judicially speaking, in America, say the Second Circuit or the Ninth Circuit being very willing to take on the universal nature of claiming and honor international treaties and so on, apply it even domestically. But we have people running for president who are climbing over themselves to run in the opposite direction. And even Obama doesn't get very good marks on being in the same normative universe that you or I might be in. So I'm wondering if the word normativity might be more of a bit of an aspiration rather than a reality, or if there are different spheres of normativity. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm sure there are different spheres, but my argument is that, in fact, for a variety of reasons, and we could think about what those reasons might be, this is a moment where the legal vocabulary of accountability is on the rise. And if you look at, and again, this is not the kind of research I do. I did a little bit of sort of number crunching of certain words that political actors use, and certainly Obama. And if you think about his Cairo speech or his Nobel Prize, he articulated this very clearly. He said that there are certain evils that where you'll need to use force. He talked about it in both legal terms and with respect to the use of force. So it's those two bits of it. When you talk about spheres, this is not sort of just theory and law in the books or law in the courtroom. It's the way law is used and legal understandings of accountability and protection of humans. The way this is used to justify political action. So that's what interests me. Now you could say, well, why is it case by case, or why, the skepticism could be, targeted to particular. You could say, why is it the U.S. Less law-abiding or tends to use arguments of exceptions? And that would be a different kind of skepticism. But my strong sense is that this is a very appealing language, and part of it is it's universalizable. It's not always universal, but it's universalizable in a way that certain religious discourses and others that are more controversial and up for grabs right now wouldn't be. So that's that's my view. Now, when you talk about the Second Circuit and Ninth Circuit, certainly the purview of courts. Obviously, this is what courts do, apply law. But how do those cases get to the courts? Multinationals using the law, a variety of NGOs. There are a number of instances where you can see that that the turn to courts is not just being, yes, there are lawyers involved, but it isn't just the universe of lawyers. It's really political and economic actors that are turning to courts for conflict resolution. So anyway, obviously there are a number of different dimensions to your argument. The one I do agree with is that there is still, of course, a gap between the full protection, having a world that is completely shaped by human security. I can't say that that is, the world we live in. On the other hand, when you see that more and more justifications that are based on defense of states and state interests and state borders are not recognized and are seen as almost impermissible, that is a very interesting set of developments to my mind. And that, point suggests that we're in, even wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, as contested as they were, had human security arguments in addition to the state interest argument. So the argument in Afghanistan, people did talk about the human rights of women there, right? They talked, and in the case of Iraq, okay, you can laugh, but I am concerned about women in Libya. If one of the first laws that's passed after we clear the airspace is, how many wives a man can have. There's going to be contestation, and gender is going to be one of those playing fields, and it'll be interesting to see what role certain UN resolutions will play in that, because that will be a way to go to, something that is more universalizable than other discourses. And to give you an example, Kitty McKinnon, Catherine McKinnon, a well-known feminist, has moved away from human rights law to this framework, to the law of war. And really, her view is that, that's a place where the offenses are clear, where they're recognized, where, rape and so on is being enforced by a tribunal without the same kind of, waffling and undermining, and that also gender plays a different role in combat than it does in ordinary times. So it's a very interesting question, where people turn to the law of war for greater protection than you can find in many countries of the world. So, yeah.
Alan, do you have another question?
Well, I'll pass.
Yeah.
I have a question as to whether or not this could be like an overly Western idea of justice. Because it's supposed to be for human security, like the greater human good. And a few things sort of sparked that. One, you said it was, I guess, sort of put together by the victors of the war in Germany, who are big proponents of
The
this.
Nuremberg example.
Oh,
Obviously,
so
there are other, yeah.
okay.
The others, the ICC was General Assembly, and mostly small states were behind that. So nobody thought it would work.
Okay.
The American delegate almost went home before the end of it. That is an interesting story. Yeah.
Well, and then the other thing I was wondering, one is the huge focus on legal action to deal with these human rights problems. The other thing is a focus on anti-terrorism, or you mentioned a little bit of anti-drug law or anti-drug action, which seem to be big, like Western ideas of justice.
Terrorism, counterterrorism.
Counterterrorism, yeah.
And what did you want to finish the thought?
No. Well, if that seems, if first of all if I'm correct in that thinking, and also if that is problematic by not including the entire human or all humans in it.
Right. No. So of course I would be concerned if I thought of it as only Western. And in fact, there's a blurb in the back of the book by Bob Cohen raised the issue of China. And what would China have to say about humanity law framework? Which is it's an interesting question. Part of what I would say is that many of the illustrations and cases that I look at don't just relate to industrialized states in the West. And where does Latin America fit in your map, right? Okay, it's not Asia. But it's not the U.S. either, and it's not Europe. One of the places where the courts have been most active has been the Inter-American Court, and really providing remedies and thinking about the protection of those who are survivors have disappeared and so on, and terrorism plays a role there too. One of the leading cases that has gone to the Inter-American Court involved terror and counter-terror from the Fujimori period. And in Latin America, terrorism was a big term way before the U.S. discovered it in the 1990s. And many of us who wrote about transitional justice, that was, people who were labeled enemies of the state, many of them were labeled terrorists, right? And so on. So I would say these references to the importance of having some form of accountability appear on all sides of this, the divide that you're talking about. And in fact, one of the most central cases that raises issues that terrorism raises, and I'm not, this is without even buying into that term, but the whole question, of intimidation by non-state actors is at this point being addressed specifically by courts in claims that are brought by private actors. It's instances where states often can't, are not able to deal with the issue or choose not to, and the courts have addressed it. Now, I do think it's interesting, there's something to ponder, the U.S. Response to 9/11 and so on, and that whole ongoing, right, people refer to Obama and the shortcomings, apparent shortcomings of the current administration policy. I think it's very interesting that a lot of the debates, and that's what I'm looking at, is how did the debates end up in the legal realm. So, it's not whether we're for or against, but that's an interesting development. And so, we spent the first couple of years under the Bush period, what is this? What kind of war is this? They call it a global war, and they call it a global war on purpose, right? Because it shapes what kind of, norms, calling it a war would mean, thinking about this in terms of the law of war. Of course, then they say that almost all of the law of war doesn't apply, right? So, you can have this infinite regress about the law. But then the other point that, and the Obama administration hasn't really stepped away from this either, is what do we call those people, right? And so, the whole debate, instead of, really talking about the politics and the fact that we had actually supported bin Laden in the war on communism, and my students, I was teaching at the time, my students, wondered, where did this come from? It came from the sky, right? Like literally from the sky. No. And instead of getting into those questions, it was really, what do we call them legally? And so now it's not enemy combatants, it's alien enemy belligerents, AEBs, okay, which is like worse, all right, I think, apparently the treatment is better in the sense that there won't be torture, so that's an that's an area of progress, but again, the debates were legal, right? It was, is torture legal? Is torture, is what they're doing legal? Is waterboarding legal? I mean, if you think about the 3-4 central debates that dominated the media, and then, even before that, going into the Iraq War, it wasn't about the politics. Is there evidence, right? Where, everything, the UN became a court of law, right? Where you have Colin Powell showing the evidence, right? The non-evidence, right? So that's very interesting to me. Is this quest for some kind of arbiter and the language of constraints, not all of which should be accepted, but I think that if once we see it, then we're in a better position really to make the right arguments and to understand. So, I don't know.
I'm interested in what you're saying about the operation of responsibility to protect, because it seems to me that while we may be using that term, what is seen as warranting intervention is still fairly arbitrary in terms of human rights. Like, we intervened in Libya for human rights violations, but we didn't intervene in Darfur, and there's not really a place to intervene in Syria. So I wonder if it's not possible that states are still acting according to interest, but then you throw on these terms of responsibility to protect or human rights violations in order to make interest-driven intervention more legitimate.
Well, if that's what's going on, it would be bad. It would be wrong, right? But I think the more people understand about, this framework and the appeals politically, I think once you start talking about other institutions and other actors using this, not just state actors, right? Where there are claims being made and demands being made by, in Libya, demands being made by people in Libya, and it was the existing, council. that, that said, don't stop, come, to intervene, and the Arab League. I mean, that was an instance where there was, I think the consensus surprised everyone, and then the actions were taken, decision was taken very quickly. And that's part of what people worry about, that, there were other instances where there's been inaction and slow, over-deliberation, and, maybe, but, I don't, and maybe this is the optimism, I don't think, to my mind, the fact that decisions are made case by case within a principled framework doesn't mean that is arbitrary and pretextual. Decisions about entering militarily on humanitarian grounds are always going to involve two sides of the